Today, markets moved lower, especially discretionary stocks, after breaking news that the Supreme Court of the United States will not issue a ruling today on the president's tariffs. At first glance, that might not sound dramatic. No ruling yet does not mean no ruling ever. But for markets, delay itself is information, and uncertainty is something investors absolutely hate. In this video, we're going to break down why this delay matters, what the Supreme Court is likely debating behind closed doors, the most realistic scenarios for how this ruling could land, whether tariff refunds are actually on the table, why the administration is not panicking at all, and what all of this means for markets, inflation, and the economy going into 2026. This is not about politics. This is about power, law, money, and market psychology. Let's get into it. Why markets sold off today? 1. 3. The immediate market reaction was a pullback in discretionary stocks. Why discretionary? Because tariffs function like a hidden tax on consumers. When tariffs are uncertain, companies don't know how to price goods. Supply chains hesitate, retail margins compress, and consumers pull back on spending. The key thing to understand is this: the Supreme Court not ruling today does not change policy. What it does is extend uncertainty. Markets were hoping for clarity. Either tariffs are upheld, or tariffs are struck down, or there's a partial compromise. Instead, investors got wait longer. Historically, when the Supreme Court takes longer than expected on a high-profile economic case, it often signals internal disagreement. That's where this story becomes important. What the delay really signals. According to policy analysts like Tobin Marcus from Wolfe Research, the delay itself is not a strong signal about the final outcome. But it does suggest something meaningful. It suggests the justices are conflicted. Based on oral arguments, the Supreme Court appears divided into three general camps. One group is skeptical of broad executive power. Another group is inclined to defer to the president. And a middle block is trying to avoid creating a political or institutional earthquake. That middle block likely includes Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett. They are under intense pressure. They do not want to fully endorse sweeping tariff authority, but they also do not want to issue a ruling that looks like a direct rebuke of the presidency. When courts face this kind of dilemma, they usually look for a narrow, technical compromise. What middle ground actually means? 538.30. A middle ground ruling does not mean everyone wins. It means the court limits the damage. Here are the most realistic outcomes. First possibility: a prospective ruling only. The court could say the tariffs were legally defective, but apply the ruling only going forward. That would mean no refunds, no retroactive consequences, and a signal to fix the legal basis. Second possibility: allowing the administration to cure the defect. The court could rule that the authority used was flawed, but give the White House time to reimpose the tariffs using a different legal tool. Justice Alito even suggested during oral arguments that another statute, such as Section 338, could have been used to achieve much of the same outcome. Third possibility: partial invalidation. Some tariffs could be struck down while others remain. Most analysts believe the court does not want to decide which emergencies are real enough to justify tariffs. That would require judges to second-guess national security determinations, something courts traditionally avoid. The $130 billion question. Refunds. 8/30/11. This is the biggest economic wildcard in the entire case. If tariffs were collected unlawfully, the standard legal remedy would be refunds. We are talking about roughly $130 billion. That is not small. That amount equals about half a percentage point of GDP. It would act like a major fiscal stimulus. It would suddenly inject cash onto corporate balance sheets. So why does almost no one expect refunds? Because the logistics are overwhelming, the political consequences would be massive, and the court may want to avoid directly antagonizing the administration. Investors and analysts are deeply skeptical refunds will actually happen, not because refunds are illegal, but because they are institutionally disruptive. This is exactly why a narrow, forward-looking ruling is so attractive to the court. Why the White House is not worried. 11/13/30. Here's what markets often underestimate. The administration has multiple backup plans. If the court strikes down tariffs under one authority, the White House can reimpose them under Section 301, Section 122, or other trade statutes. Officials have been very clear that they are prepared. That means tariffs are unlikely to disappear overnight. Policy continuity is still the base case. And markets should not expect a clean off-ramp. Some investors hope the Supreme Court would give the administration political cover to ease tariffs. Most analysts believe that is wishful thinking. Donald Trump has consistently supported tariffs as a core economic tool, and this ruling is unlikely to change that philosophy. Macro impact: short-term versus long-term, 13 to 3016. In the short term, expect volatility, sector-specific pressure, and risk-off positioning. In the long term, tariffs likely remain in place, supply chains continue adjusting, and inflation impacts remain manageable. Even economists like Mohammed El-Arian have said they do not expect a major macroeconomic shock from this ruling. The real macro impact only appears if refunds happen or if tariff coverage expands unexpectedly. Most analysts believe neither outcome is likely. Will tariffs expand to new sectors? 1618. Another concern investors raised was whether new legal workarounds could broaden tariffs into new sectors. Most experts say no. Even fallback authorities are written broadly, but the administration can narrow application. The goal is continuity, not expansion. Tariff targeting is expected to remain focused on strategic imports. An accidental expansion across unrelated sectors is very unlikely. Here is the bottom line. The Supreme Court delay signals internal conflict, not collapse. A middle ground ruling is the most likely outcome. Refunds remain the biggest wild card, but they are unlikely. Tariffs will almost certainly continue under some legal framework. Markets are reacting to uncertainty, not catastrophe. This case is not really about tariffs. It is about how much power the presidency has during emergencies and how carefully the court wants to define that line. This is where the story shifts from legal theory to real economic risk. Because while the Supreme Court deliberates, the economy does not pause. Businesses are making decisions right now. Investors are repositioning right now. Supply chains are adjusting right now. And all of it is happening under the shadow of a ruling that could redefine how far presidential economic power actually goes. To understand what's really at stake, you have to understand the environment this ruling is landing in. This is not 2017. This is not a low inflation, low rate world. This is an economy already stretched in multiple directions. Growth is strong on paper, but fragile underneath. Consumers are still spending, but increasingly on credit. Corporate profits remain high, but margins are under pressure. Tariffs are not entering a calm system. They are being layered onto an economy already running hot in some places and brittle in others. That is why the Supreme Court delay matters far more than a simple calendar question. It extends uncertainty into a moment when confidence itself is doing most of the work. Let's talk about the administration's position. From the White House perspective, this case is not just about tariffs. It is about precedent. If the court sharply limits emergency trade authority, it doesn't just affect this administration, it affects every future president. That is why officials have repeatedly emphasized preparedness. You heard it directly from Kevin Hassett, who made clear that there is not just a Plan B, but a Plan C and a Plan D. That matters because it changes the market's downside assumptions. If tariffs were simply at risk of vanishing, markets would rally on relief. But when investors know tariffs can be reimposed almost immediately under alternative statutes, the calculus changes. Now uncertainty replaces optimism. The administration's confidence is also political. Donald Trump has consistently framed tariffs as leverage, not punishment. In his view, tariffs are a negotiating tool, a revenue tool, and a domestic political signal all at once. That belief system is not shaken by legal friction. In fact, legal resistance may reinforce it. From this perspective, backing down would look like weakness, not pragmatism. That is why analysts increasingly believe there is no easy off-ramp here. Now let's talk about the court itself. The Supreme Court is not blind to economic consequences. Despite popular belief, Justices do consider real-world impact, especially in cases involving hundreds of billions of dollars. What they try to avoid is being seen as the direct cause of economic disruption. That's critical. A ruling that triggers mass refunds, fiscal shock, or market chaos would place responsibility squarely on the court. Historically, courts go out of their way to avoid that. That's why prospective rulings exist. That's why remedies are often limited. That's why technical legal defects are sometimes acknowledged without aggressive enforcement. This case fits that pattern perfectly. Now let's address the issue investors are quietly watching more than anything else. Refunds. $130 billion. That number is so large, it almost doesn't feel real. To put it in perspective, that is larger than many federal stimulus programs. If refunded, that money would not go evenly into consumer spending. It would land disproportionately on corporate balance sheets. That means cash hoarding, share buybacks, debt reduction, selective capital investment. It would not be a clean stimulus, but it would still matter. Economists estimate it could add roughly half a percentage point to GDP, even with low multipliers. That is not trivial, which is exactly why it is so unlikely. Courts understand second-order effects. They understand optics. And they understand institutional self-preservation. This is why many analysts believe the court will find a way to say not legal going forward without saying pay it all back. Now zoom out. Why is the economy described as being on edge right now? Because multiple cycles are overlapping. The inflation cycle has not fully resolved. The rate cycle is restrictive. The fiscal cycle is uncertain. The political cycle is accelerating. Tariffs cut across all of them. They influence inflation expectations. They affect corporate planning horizons. They alter trade relationships. They shift geopolitical strategy. This is not just about prices at the checkout line. This is about how global capital interprets American policy stability. That's why foreign investors are watching this case closely. If emergency economic powers are upheld broadly, it signals a strong executive. If they are constrained sharply, it signals institutional resistance. Neither outcome is inherently bad, but unpredictability is. And that is what the delay reinforces. Now, let's talk about labor. One of the administration's strongest talking points has been wage growth, particularly in manufacturing. Rising wages complicate the tariff story. On one hand, tariffs are often blamed for higher prices. On the other hand, higher wages can offset some of that impact, but only if productivity keeps pace. This is where recent productivity numbers become critical. Strong productivity growth gives the administration room. It allows higher wages without runaway inflation. It supports the argument that tariffs are not crushing growth. But productivity cycles can reverse quickly, and tariffs can interfere with productivity by raising input costs. This creates a narrow path. If productivity stays strong, the administration looks vindicated. If productivity weakens, tariffs become an easy scapegoat. That is why timing matters. The longer the court delays, the longer markets have to speculate. Now consider politics. A Supreme Court ruling landing in an election year amplifies everything. Even a narrow legal ruling becomes a headline. Even a technical decision becomes a narrative weapon. That's another reason the court may want to move carefully. Judicial restraint is not just legal philosophy. It is institutional survival. The court has no interest in becoming a campaign issue, which brings us back to the most likely outcome. A ruling that limits the legal theory, avoids refunds, allows continuity, signals boundaries, minimizes disruption. That is the sweet spot. And that is what most serious analysts expect. So what should viewers take away from all this? First, the delay is not a signal of collapse. Second, tariffs are not going away overnight. Third, refunds remain unlikely. Fourth, markets are reacting to uncertainty, not fundamentals. And finally, this case is about power more than policy. It is about how much economic authority the presidency holds during crises, and how carefully the Supreme Court wants to draw that line. That is why this ruling matters long after the headlines fade. Global shockwaves, refunds, and presidential power. At this stage of the story, the focus shifts outward. Until now, we've talked about markets, courts, and domestic politics. But the Supreme Court's decision on tariffs does not stop at America's borders. It ripples outward. It affects allies, trade partners, supply chains, and governments that have already been forced to adapt to years of policy unpredictability. And nowhere is that more visible than in Canada. According to reporting summarized in the CTV analysis, U.S. Supreme Court could rule. This case is among the most closely watched decisions expected from the Supreme Court of the United States. The core legal question is simple on the surface. Are these tariffs legal, or are they not? But the consequences of that answer are anything but simple. The tariffs in question were imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, often referred to as IEEPA. This law gives the president broad authority during a declared national emergency. What makes this case unique is not just the use of that authority, but how far it was stretched. Tariffs were imposed not only on adversaries, but also on close allies, including Canada. That alone raised eyebrows internationally. For Canadian businesses, this was not theoretical. These tariffs were paid. Paperwork was filed. Costs were absorbed. Margins were adjusted. According to trade experts cited in the report, businesses were advised to keep meticulous records in case refunds ever became possible. That tells you something important. Refunds are not just an abstract legal question. They are already being planned for, at least on paper. But planning does not mean expectation. In fact, there is widespread skepticism that any refund process would be clean or even feasible. And this is where the story deepens. If the Supreme Court rules that the tariffs were illegally imposed, the default legal logic would suggest refunds. But the scale of those refunds would be massive. We are talking about tens of billions of dollars collected across multiple countries, industries, and time periods. Returning that money would require an administrative process of staggering complexity. Who gets paid first? Which tariffs qualify? How do you handle goods that were resold, repackaged, or transformed? What about downstream costs that were passed along to consumers? The legal theory may be clean. The real-world execution would not be. That is why even trade experts interviewed express little optimism about a smooth refund process. This is not just a bureaucratic challenge. It is a political one. Refunding tariffs would look, to many voters, like admitting failure. It would be framed as a loss of leverage. It would also potentially inject a massive amount of money into corporate balance sheets at a politically sensitive moment. That is not a decision courts take lightly. Now let's talk about Canada's position more specifically. Canada's government has been notably restrained in public commentary. According to sources cited in the CTV report, officials are allowing the judicial process to play out while quietly preparing for upcoming trade reviews. That silence is strategic. Canada has learned over the past decade that reacting publicly to U.S. trade policy often backfires. Instead, the focus is on contingency planning. What happens if tariffs stay? What happens if they are restructured? What happens if new authorities are used? Canadian trade data shows something telling. Despite all the noise around tariffs, overall trade with the U.S. has remained in a kind of holding pattern. Trade flows have not collapsed. Instead, what has changed is where growth is coming from. Exports to non-U.S. countries have surged. That suggests adaptation. Businesses are not waiting for clarity. They are diversifying, and that diversification has long-term consequences. Once supply chains move, they rarely snap back perfectly. That means even if tariffs are eventually eased or restructured, some trade patterns may already be permanently altered. Now zoom back to the U.S. administration. Despite the legal uncertainty, Donald Trump has continued to publicly praise tariffs. In social media posts, he has framed tariffs as a symbol of strength and national resurgence. That messaging matters. It signals intent. It suggests that regardless of how the Supreme Court rules, the administration is not looking to retreat. Trade experts quoted in the report reinforce this view. They expect tariffs to continue in some form, irrespective of the outcome. This aligns with what we discussed earlier. The administration has alternative legal tools. If one path is blocked, another can be used. Which brings us to a deeper question. What is this case really about? On the surface, it is about tariffs. Underneath, it is about presidential power. Specifically, how much economic authority the president can wield under the banner of an emergency. If the Supreme Court upholds the tariffs broadly, it sends a powerful message. It says that emergency declarations can justify sweeping economic actions, even against allies. That precedent would extend far beyond trade. If the court sharply limits that authority, it sends a different message. It signals that emergencies have boundaries. That executive power is not unlimited. But here's the catch. There are other tariff statutes on the books. If the court strikes down IEEPA-based tariffs, does that implicitly cast doubt on those other authorities as well? That is one of the most delicate questions the justices are facing. They may worry that ruling too broadly could destabilize the entire framework of U.S. trade law. That is not something the court wants to do casually. This is why the decision could be narrowly tailored. It could focus on specific procedural flaws. It could avoid sweeping language. It could preserve alternative authorities while limiting this particular application. In other words, it could thread the needle. Now let's return to the idea of uncertainty. For businesses, uncertainty is often worse than bad news. Bad news can be priced in. Uncertainty cannot. That is why companies on both sides of the border are watching this case so closely, not because they expect tariffs to vanish, but because they want to know the rules of the game. Are emergencies a blank check, or are they conditional? Are refunds possible, or are they theoretical? Is trade policy going to remain volatile, or stabilize under clearer legal guardrails? These questions affect hiring decisions. They affect investment timelines. They affect whether companies commit to long-term projects or stay flexible. And all of that feeds back into the economy. Now consider the broader global message. Other countries are watching this case not just for its outcome, but for its tone. Does the Supreme Court emphasize restraint? Does it emphasize deference? Does it emphasize institutional balance? Those signals matter in diplomacy. They shape how foreign governments interpret U.S. commitments. They influence negotiations. They affect trust. In a world already fragmented by geopolitical tension, legal clarity becomes a form of soft power. That's why this ruling is not just a domestic legal moment. It is a global one. Now let's talk about what happens the day after the ruling. Regardless of the outcome, there will be headlines. Markets will react. Politicians will spin. But beneath the surface, the real work begins. If tariffs are upheld, businesses must continue adapting. If tariffs are struck down prospectively, lawyers will scramble to reinterpret contracts. If refunds are hinted at, even vaguely, accounting departments will start modeling scenarios. And if alternative authorities are invoked, new legal challenges may follow. This case does not end uncertainty. It reshapes it. That is an important distinction. Many viewers may be waiting for closure. What they are more likely to get is a transition from one form of uncertainty to another. That is not failure. That is the nature of governance in a complex system. Now bring this back to the viewer. Why should you care? Because trade policy affects prices. It affects jobs. It affects growth. And it affects how resilient the economy is during shocks. Whether you are an investor, a business owner, or a consumer, the ripple effects eventually reach you. That is why this ruling matters. Not because it will instantly change your life, but because it shapes the environment in which economic decisions are made. And environments matter. As we move toward the conclusion of this series, the key theme emerges clearly. This is not about whether tariffs are good or bad. It is about how power is exercised, how law interacts with economics, and how institutions manage conflict without breaking. The Supreme Court's decision will not settle the tariff debate, but it will define the boundaries within which that debate continues. And that, ultimately, is why the world is watching. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. When the Supreme Court ruling finally drops, we'll break it down the same day, clearly and calmly, without the noise. Thanks for watching.